Kino pavasaris. Kovo 18, balandžio 5 dienomis visoje Lietuvoje. Didysis partneris – Ergo draudimo grupė. Informaciniai partneriai – TV3, 15 min, žmonės.
Mūsų karta pirmoji supratusi, kaip iš lėto kenkiame gamtai. Ir vienintelė, žinanti, kad dar yra laiko ją išsaugoti. Apsaugokime mūsų visų ateitį. Ergo.
Geriausius kino pavasario filmus parodys žiūrimiausia televizija TV3. Šeštadieniais 22:40.
Festivalis Kino pavasaris jūsų namuose. Visus filmus žiūrėkite Telia televizijoje jums patogiu metu. Telia. Įdomiau tik gyvenimas.
Visiškas 2021 metų atradimas. Labai skaniai susukta. Ragaučiau antrą kartą.
Hello everybody, labas, and welcome to the Q&A portion of FAUNA. Very happy that you're all here watching, and I'm very, very happy and quite honored to be here to introduce the director of FAUNA, Nicolas Pereda, a filmmaker whose 9th feature film in almost just as many years, buttressed by a lot of short and medium format films, had its world premiere at the Toronto International Film Festival, followed by an illustrious trajectory of festivals like San Sebastian, New York Film Festival, Mar del Plata, Thessaloniki. And we're really happy to have the film for our 2021 festival. So without further ado, I would like to give a hello, labas, and welcome to Nicolas Pereda.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, as you've all seen, FAUNA is a very funny, playful, and multi-layered work that plays out in a very simple, linear manner. Yet, by revisiting it, actually makes the film bloom in a multitude of narrative kind of colors and nuances. And as strange as it may be to start off a Q&A with this, I would really highly encourage all of you to rewatch the film after the Q&A session, because I'm sure it will open up your reading of the movie and will add to your enjoyment of it as well. But Nicolas, I wanted to start off by asking you to describe a bit your relationship to the actors in the film that some of our viewers might not know, but they're very close collaborators of yours that have played in your previous films. You've worked with them very closely, and you've also perhaps kept them in mind when you wrote the film. So, yeah, if you can talk a bit and kind of explain to us.
So not only I've worked with the same actors for a very long time, but also they work with each other independently of my films because they have a theater company and they're directors themselves. So they're theater directors and they have a theater company. And these are the three main sort of younger actors. And then I've also worked with Teresa Sanchez, who's the mother in the film, in many of my films. And she's also a theater director herself. So it's always an interesting process because they have a lot to say, not just about the characters and the acting part of things, but also about all of the ideas in the film because they have that kind of mind, all of them. At the same time, when I'm writing the films, I write it for them directly. I'm thinking of them when I write. And perhaps one thing I can say is that what interests me about working with them is not necessarily the fact that they're very good actors, but which I think they are, but more that I'm interested in doing portraits of them. And what I mean by that is that I write these characters thinking of them, but not so that they become the characters, but kind of the opposite, that the characters become them. So that whatever I write gets modified quite drastically to fit them. Although I know them quite well, so I already write thinking about how they talk and the kind of, about their bodies and so on. But all the characters get modified, sometimes with their ideas, but mainly, I mean, I'm talking about like surface things, so like with their body, so that my intention is not for them to have to modify the way they behave. It's more about them transforming the character into themselves. So there is an element, I guess, what I'm trying to get at is that there's an element of non-fiction in the fiction. So there's an element of a portrait of the person in the films that I'm making with them that goes beyond whatever character I'm writing. They're still acting, but my idea is that they're performing. They're not being themselves, but they're like performing themselves to a certain degree.
And what was the genesis of the film per se? Was there a situation that you had in mind for them, or?
It started in two different places, the film, I would say. I think the first line was I wanted to make a film about like a small family reunion film, so very kind of simple, and it was about siblings that go visit parents that they haven't seen in a very long time, and kind of this kind of more typical generation divides, the gap between the siblings themselves, sort of like the difficulty of getting back together into a family that doesn't have much in common with each other, and that it's a little bit fragmented. And I wanted to I like the theme of that, which is, I guess, been done many, many different times. But I think every time, depending on the circumstances, depending on whatever the characters are, is interesting to me. And then there was a completely different angle, which was the world of acting that I was interested in deeply. Because I'm, like I mentioned before, that I'm interested in this kind of portraits of the performers. I like this idea that to make a film about actors, which I had never done, I think. So in none of my films, I'm trying to think back, but I think in none of my films, the profession of the characters are actors. And so it was a nice thing to try that. And also that would kind of tie in nicely into the idea of performance, but also the idea of rehearsal, which I'm interested in. And because through rehearsal, you get repetition. And I like this idea of repetition and variation. And so it was kind of like a nice lead into a lot of things that I'm interested in, to have characters that are actors. And perhaps an extension of that idea, and it's a kind of a different way of thinking about the film, or how I started thinking about the film, was through the fact that Paco, one of the main characters, acts in a TV show called Narcos Mexico, which for Mexico it's a big deal. So it's like these TV shows that have really high ratings, and at the same time, for me, they're sort of a very problematic TV show in relation to our understanding of our contemporary history. So, like, in Mexico right now, there's a kind of war going on, kind of what the Americans labeled as war on drugs has extended into different places of Latin America. Started perhaps in Colombia and now in Mexico, and it's been going on in Mexico for a long time. And the way the Americans framed war on drugs has been imported into Mexico because, of course, I think the American model is something that people have been more critical of and have a better understanding of, because obviously, American politics is kind of more known to the rest of the world than even sometimes your own politics. But this idea that anyway, the show Narcos is a show that maintains the status quo of what the Americans created, the idea of the cartels that they invented, the idea of the government having a common enemy, so it's that civil society and the government have a common enemy in the narcos, and so the narcos being like the perfect element in a government, someone's government, because you can always say that all the problems that your country has is because of these bad guys that are out there, and has nothing to do with you. It's just that the bad guys are really powerful, and that civil society should understand the government because we're in the same boat, kind of thing, again, trying to fight these bad people. And that kind of setup is a setup that the US government invented, and then that different countries in Latin America have adopted, and then different TV shows like Narcos have extended, and they're like the propaganda. And it's a strange propaganda because it's like this modern propaganda that the state doesn't even have to be involved, but because it sells, then Netflix is happy to create. Anyway, maybe I don't want to talk too much about it, but because one of my main characters was involved in the making of this, I wanted to have a conversation with him also about the responsibility of the actor and what does it mean to be in these kind of shows that not just misrepresent reality, because it's the whole idea of representation of reality is complicated, but the idea that it's constructing a whole identity that is totally invented and manufactured within Netflix, but that then is kind of adopted within Mexican society. And I'm sure this happens in other places as well, but it's quite complicated in Mexico right now because it's something that they're talking about a situation that is contemporary, that's happening right now. It's not something that they're kind of like lying about some historical events or whatever. It's something that is affecting people as we speak. So anyway, I was interested about how can we have this conversation with these actors, also because the main character of most of my films, Lázaro Gavino, he's also acted in some of these shows, not the Netflix one, but many years ago he was in some of these sort of more like narco shows, more for local consumption, not before Netflix was around. And so they were already themselves having these conversations with each other and with themselves, I guess, about we tend to put all the responsibility of cinema, of art, to the author, or whatever that means in cinema, to the director, the producers, the screenwriters. But I think there is also a responsibility in the world of acting and representation. And the whole idea of representation is interesting. The fact that we use that word is interesting to me, because we also use the word representation when we talk about politicians that represent us, right? And so the idea that and in the case of politicians, we think of them having lots of power, right, like over people, and then we give them that power to represent us in Congress or whatever. And in a way, actors have that a level of power that is, very different, of course, than politicians, but it's still a very important power. In a way, even if we kind of remove these politics from the conversation, and we think about the just simple things of acting and what actors do, the fact that probably most of us saw someone kissing on screen before we ever kissed anybody, and we had ideas of what that meant. And then when we did kiss someone, we probably, this is a very sort of general example. You can think of your own, but we probably had our own. We had our own expectations of what that kiss should feel like because of the fact that we had seen it represented so many times on screen. So it's not just in the sort of like more abstract political sense of representation, but obviously in the more direct sense of representation, actors have also a lot of power. And so anyway, all of these things interest me. Yeah.
No, but it's a very important point, because the the cultural export of Mexico, at least cinematically, has, you know, on a very commercial level, has primarily been the cartels and the drug violence. But it's interesting how you deconstruct all this, and how you actually deconstruct the levels of power in a very playful way. Of, you know, the film is by no means rather didactic, but you know, take a very evident scene when Luisa's father actually makes Paco, you know, reenact and actually play out his role, which is, you know, it's a scene where he feels almost belittled, and it's quite interesting because I think it on one side it manifests the directorial power of, or rather the authorial power of a director, you know, over his actor, but also the you know, the self-perpetuating, like I said, cultural export that one has to play into these roles in order to you know, to kind of exist within the industry.
Yeah, and it's a cultural export, but it's also something to the inside of the country as well. So it's not just what we export, but it's what we consume. Yeah, I mean, it's complicated at the same time, because I also understand that the film is not completely clear about all of these ideas, because my point of making the film was not to, you know, have these very concrete ideas and now I want to put them in a film. I think I'm interested in those kinds of films as well, more like, but I would make probably something closer to like an essay film. And I like a lot the films of like Harun Farocki or people like that, or Chris Marker, or people that are able to make films that directly address certain subjects. But at the same time, I'm perhaps more interested with the film thinking about all of these relatively complex ideas, but very complex to deliver. So I'm not really, I know that the level of ambiguity in the film makes it almost impossible to arrive at the conclusions that I've arrived. But my point is not so much to get there. My point is to kind of navigate a little bit that world, and maybe people can think about some ideas of representation, some ideas of acting. But at the end of the day, I'm interested in much simpler things in these films. These are just kind of things that feed into the construction of a screenplay, in the construction of a film. But I like the very simple sort of difficulty that a person has meeting their in-laws, and how the father-in-law can be such a pain in the ass, and how difficult it can be to relate to your family members. And so things that are a lot less abstract and a lot more sort of grounded. And then once that is sort of set up, I mean, the idea of FAUNA is that the first part is a lot easier to digest, because it's all those kind of things that are easier to talk about. And then suddenly the thing takes a big shift that hopefully, I know it's less enjoyable, the second part. It's playful also, but it's a bit more confusing perhaps. But the idea is that once you've had this thing of like laughing a little bit about the characters, and this more sort of easily engaging situation, there's a moment of reflexivity perhaps in the second part that I'm interested in. Though you're a bit more confused, it's a little bit harder to follow, but at the same time there's a moment of having to rethink what you just watched in the first part, and also think about possibilities of meaning, I guess, because I don't think I have the answer of what the films that I make are about in many ways. I just think that I'm influenced by many different things, and if I just lay down those things, I don't need to come to conclusions within the films. And because I like this idea of being able to leave something that has many possibilities of, you know, that you can understand it from many different angles, even not possibilities of interpretation, which is also possible, but even just kind of possibilities of how to engage with it, even if there is no meaning to be derived, perhaps, but just the idea that you can, by having a second part that makes you rethink the first half and makes you rethink about what you're watching, perhaps different people react to to that kind of disjuncture in different ways. And I like movies where different people think different things about what they just watched. So.
I mean, for me, I think the first part is not necessarily just a setup in the simple terms of it, but you lay out all of the elements and all of your kind of formal methods that you will play with in the second part. I mean, first of all, the tonal shift that happens in the middle, we see that earlier on as well. I mean, it moves from a kind of like a situationist comedy of errors to a kind of domestic realist drama or story to suspense in the bar, right? So you have all these kind of very subtle tonal shifts that when the clean break happens, because of a piece of literature, which I will ask about in a bit, that is more radical. But I think you've already kind of set us up for that, and it's interesting how you actually end up. Yeah.
No, that the whole structure of the film, these two parts of the film are not just two parts, but there's perhaps smaller parts, especially in the first half, that prepares perhaps the audience for this. It's constantly being sort of interrupted, or the genres are always being interrupted by other genres. Perhaps not so much blending, but with each other, but maybe kind of, yeah, like you said, like this kind of situation comedy of errors, and then the family drama, the bit of thriller or mystery. They're all embedded in the first half somehow, and yeah, I don't know what else to say about that.
No, because I think it feels so organic, the way everything kind of moves along. One thing that I did want to ask you about is apropos of literature, because tonal shifts in narrative in literature could be quite jarring, but we're not really fully aware of it as we're reading along, perhaps. Whereas in cinema, the effect is quite immediate. One would say,
because there's a physical sense, there's something that is plastic, like the image changes and so drastically, whereas I mean, it's a complicated thing, and it is a very literary thing at the same time. It's like an influence from literature, but it's a very strong thing that one can do in cinema in that sense, because it's so drastic. I like a lot it's strange, and just to go back a little bit to this other part that we just spoke about because I thought about something about this different genres, and then the disruption of them, and then just sort of the literary device disrupting. It seems all very formal and calculated, and at the same time, what I enjoy about these changes are the kind of the scene themselves. So like my attempt is not to focus on the break, but a little bit I'm interested in focus in more in the moment itself. So just to be a bit more clear, the scene where the break happens, where Gavino's reading the book and Luisa comes out and she asks him what he's reading, it's a scene that I liked quite a bit, because it's a very mundane scene in which she first asks what he's reading, but then kind of they dismiss the book for a little bit, and then they talk about like a girlfriend that he had or something, and then they're just kind of like sitting there, and it's almost like we've forgotten that this book was. It was not like the actors kind of jump into, okay, what is the scene about? The scene is about the book and the transition, so they just kind of go towards it. It's more like it's there, the transition is kind of part of it, but it's also a scene. And at the end of the day, I'm more interested in the scene. At that moment while watching, I'm more interested not where the scene is going, but what the scene is in the moment, how they look at each other, how their bodies look, the fact that he's not wearing a t-shirt and that she comes in and she's wearing her pajamas, and how these siblings that haven't seen each other in a long time have like a small moment in the morning with each other. That's what this scene is about. It's not a scene about the transition from one genre to the next. It's a scene about siblings trying to, have a small conversation after not seeing each other for a long time and having had a strange night the night before. And so I like how they manage, and it's something that the actors are good at, I think, how they manage to downplay the meaning of things. Sort of like it seems like the scenes are about something, but they manage to remove that and not play into those things, and easily sort of adopt more the everyday, the present moment. Not they're never addressing what the film is about. They're always just there living a moment, and I think that's what that's at the end of the day, that's what I'm interested in. The transition, the genre devices are a way to present this other moment. They're just kind of paths into this kind of more mundane moments and ways to introduce a little bit of thematic things that I'm interested in. But mainly, so you see them having this conversation, they're just being, siblings, you see that tension. And then what the shift of the narrative allows me to do is then suddenly I can explore a different type of relationship with these characters. So the shift in and of itself, the moment of the shift, I have to find a way to make it as organic as possible, because the film is not about the shift. I like then when I want to be able to make a scene like the scene with both of them again smoking fake cigarettes later in the film. But in order to get there, I need to do a narrative shift, because those characters from the first part wouldn't engage in what happens later. And so I like doing the narrative shift so I can get to this other place, but the emphasis is not necessarily for me in the shift. So I try to make I try to put more emphasis in their relationship and their bodies and so on, and not so much on the structural element, which in this film, I've never done anything like this, by the way, like this. Maybe a little bit in a film called Greatest Hits, but most of my films that has a little bit of that, but in this film I think it's a lot more, a lot more straightforward, a lot more present.
It's fluid. I mean, it somehow works within the framework of, like, or rather the setup of the scene itself. And I want to go back a bit before that scene, the moment with Luisa and her mother in bed, which is a very intimate, very, I wouldn't say necessarily say banal, but it's it's a quotidian moment, which all of a sudden gets elevated, also through the formal setup, the foreground background relationship between Luisa and her mother. But the rehearsal itself kind of elevates that scene into something a lot greater, that lends substance to their relationship rather than just becoming, like you said, like almost like a formal device,
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of nice to be able to have some moments, some scenes that have various different functions, that it's not just the anxiety of the daughter and how she's going to deal with this audition, and you can really tell that she has sort of like a crisis in her career, perhaps because this acting thing might not be working out exactly because she has such level of anxiety for an audition. But at the same time, it's a scene about a mother and a daughter and their relationship and their difficulties with one another. I took that scene. Actually, the original scene comes from Autumn Sonata of Bergman, and in that movie, for those of you that haven't seen it or don't remember it, it's Ingrid Bergman is a famous pianist, and the daughter is Liv Ullmann, who also plays piano, but not nearly as well as the mother. And the mother comes back after, and the mother really kind of like doesn't really care about the daughter too much and is never around. And when the mother comes back, she asks Liv Ullmann to play a piece for her, and Liv Ullmann sort of hates the fact that she has to do this for the mother because she is aware that the mother is so much better. And then so she plays the piano for the mother, and then the mother is a bit like, you know, she's a bit disappointed, obviously, by the daughter, but then plays it for the daughter, plays the same piece, and then you realize how, you know, the mother is so much better, and the daughter realizes this. And so I wanted to recreate the same moment. And so the same moment that happens in the piano, but I used lines from a different moment in the film. So in a different moment in Autumn Sonata, they have that dialogue. But I sort of use that dialogue to mimic that previous moment in Autumn Sonata. It's a little bit complicated to explain, but basically it's not exactly the same situation as Autumn Sonata, but it's just two moments in Autumn Sonata that are kind of blended into each other. And I like a lot this possibility. It's not for me this kind of nerdiness of quoting or things like that. I just think that I enjoy a lot seeing something that works, that I love, that I see in cinema or in literature that I think is like wonderful, or in other mediums, and then taking it for myself as kind of like a gift that someone else has given the world, and then playing with it, transforming it. And of course, I don't attempt to improve it in any way. It's not about improving anything, because I also don't think it has to do with, there's no value system in art exactly, but it's more this fact that I can take these things and play around with them and transform them for myself. And it's kind of like, it's incredibly enjoyable. And they don't necessarily need to be sort of great pieces, because the scene preceding it is a scene that that Paco acts out and performs from the TV show Narcos, and it's also taken from that TV show, just kind of transformed a little bit, also in my way. So it's not necessarily, in Narcos it was a different idea of why I'm using it and how I'm using it, but in this film, more than, I think it's the first time I do it so evidently and so often, that this film is full of little quotes and yeah, using scenes from other places and taking ideas and characters from some books and transforming them. I think kind of there's something wonderful about being able to, because at the end of the day, we're all clearly incredibly influenced by things around us. I mean, artists in general, and sometimes we, you know, do things unconsciously and we recreate things and we come up with ideas that we think are ours, but you know, they've unconsciously been sort of adopted. So for this film, I thought I would just full on sort of take other works and think about them. Also because it's a film about representation and a film about acting, and in a way, actors are performers. The idea of like the performance, the idea of whether it's actors or musicians, is many times that you are using someone else's sort of script, someone else's composition, and you are giving it your own interpretation, let's say. In Spanish, performers are called interpreters as well. I don't know if in English that is also the case, that the singer is an interpreter, right? Like someone that interprets someone else's work and then does their own rendering of it. So in a way, I thought of my screenwriting and my directing as a form of, as an interpreter in a way. Like I'm gonna grab these things and I'm gonna read them in my own way and sort of deliver them with my own, sort of putting myself in a similar level as the actors.
It's really funny because actually the theme of this year's festival is to act or to be. And it's a theme that, I mean, the notion itself could kind of boil down to an existential kind of quandary, but also with respect to performance or rather truth, veracity, falsity. And I think Fauna is almost like a quintessential film for that, for the theme of the festival in this sense.
Yeah, I mean, because also to me it's kind of it's all the time. It has to do very directly with Paco and his, because Paco, for example, that line, again, the same scene that we talked about, not only he's in the show, but he has very few lines in the show. So so what he's saying, at least in the first season, at the time that we were shooting, and so when he performs in silence, which is kind of like a funny sort of little comedy of like him trying to perform a scene for the father-in-law, and then the whole scene is just in silence. He's actually doing the movements that he does in the show, so it's not like he's just recreating what he actually did for the show. So he's performing himself in that sense, even if it's like very comedic. And then when he goes on and he's like, okay, you want a scene, I'll give you a scene, he does this, he's performing the same scene, but now he's taking the character of the main character of that scene. So so in a way, and in that whole process, and it was difficult for Paco, obviously. It was a very, we should have talked more about this. We did that scene only once, also because Paco was like, he said to me almost like, I'll do this once and let's just get it in one take. Because there was something very fragile about him. He felt unbelievably vulnerable because it's all playful and it's like a funny scene, but at the same time, it's a scene that is existentially difficult for Paco because he's basically criticizing, almost making fun of or mocking his whole endeavor for the last couple of years. He's been involved in the show for a very long time, and now he's sort of questioning on screen for everybody to watch, with all of his friends around watching this kind of existential moment. It's a very, let's call it like very documentary, very cathartic moment for him, even if you don't see it because you don't know that this is happening, but he's very opening himself a lot. So it's not just sort of an actor performing in that sense, it's also a person opening himself up and being extremely vulnerable. And
it's almost, I don't want to perhaps no, sorry, I was just going to say, I might be a bit not necessarily saying it correctly, but it's almost a form of minstrelsy in a way. Of minstrelsy.
I don't understand that word, sorry.
He's almost because he's like a minstrel. How African Americans. How African Americans
like a minister?
No, minstrel, minstrel. When African Americans were basically being asked to perform black for the white audience, or for a large audience, and
I didn't know that word. Yeah, it's a very vulnerable thing to do. Yes.
Yeah.
And then the whole film has these ideas of that you mentioned that the festival is interested in, of the sort of this small fluctuation between being and performing, perhaps, of being or acting. And at the same time, I think for many filmmakers, I don't know if most, one of the most interesting thing about casting has to do with seeing whether an actor that is on screen, the person that's going to perform a character, whether you can still see some of that person in the character, whether once you film them, there is something about them that will come through. That there is a big difference between having a puppet than having an actor, not because of their abilities of interpretation, but because of their vulnerability as a human. That there is always an element of the actual person in the frame, and so I try to push this as much as I can in my films in general.
I mean, there's almost this. I think what happens is this slippage of when the being kind of slips into the acting and kind of cracks it open a bit.
Yeah, and perhaps I want to just say that in the second part of the film, the wigs work in this direction to me, because they're really kind of like absurd, but they're not completely up. I mean, there are these wigs that are a bit not perfect wigs, are kind of strange, especially his wig. And then because of the wig, which is a fake thing, then the real thing shines a bit more. Then the fact that you see that there is a human under that wig makes it even more obvious that there's a person there, if that makes any sense.
And yeah, absolutely. And it's not just with the wigs, because I was going to ask actually about your use of kind of objects as symbols, or rather as narrative dramaturgical symbols. I mean, the wigs, obviously, for one thing, being first of all, they mask or they transform, but they're almost so in your face, and yet at the same time, their effect and their impact happens regardless of their But I would also bring up cigarettes, the actual gesture of smoking, but the cigarette itself, which on one hand it could be used as a reference for for a previous scene of comedy, which then all of a sudden becomes a scene of kind of or rather represents a whole different symbol in the bar scene. And of course, it's kind of symbolic association with noirs and with power and with.
I like the cigarette thing a lot, but it's very strange because I've realized that in contemporary American cinema, mainly, I would say, cigarettes are these things that only bad characters use. Sort of like people that are like dying, you're allowed to smoke if you're in your, if you have like a cancer that is not going to be treatable, then okay, you can smoke. But if not, then you smoke only because you're the bad guy or the criminal or the misfit, or there's something wrong with you. Whereas the reason, and so it's kind of funny to me, this whole idea of this kind of very, to turn cigarettes into like this evil thing. And at the same time, the reason why I use the cigarettes in the films is because we smoke, all of us. And so because we smoke, then it's a part of our lives. It's not something that is like completely a device. And so the same way that we use other things in films, like we eat and we drink water and we drink coffee, we also smoke. And so the possibility of transforming sort of everyday things is kind of a normal thing to do. And and a lot of movies have dinner scenes that go sour, and then the food has something, it's part of the whole dynamic. And for me, so to use the cigarettes is something very natural, because it's something that, we will be doing a take, while between takes we're all smoking as well, and perhaps not the person that has to smoke in the scene because they're sick of smoking, but it's not something totally foreigner. It's not something like, oh, we have the cigarettes for the scene and nobody touches them. It's more like it's part of the moment, and so that's why we can play with them. I always try to introduce things that might have some meaning, perhaps, or might be interpreted in one way or another, but at the same time they're totally organic to the situation, to us, to life.
Yeah. And one last question before we're going to have to wrap up. I really want to ask about space, and the particularity of the area that you shot in, especially. And also, I found it quite interesting how apropos of repetition and in some sense, representation of a space. How one can perhaps, once you revisit a space, but you can also reinfuse it or load it with different kind of dramaturgical resonances. So the bar is one that gets repeated, and all of a sudden, kind of a simple meeting at the bar itself becomes a place of tension and of greater tension and violence. Also, the field itself where Gambino kind of wanders aimlessly, in his kind of post drunk state, but then it takes on kind of like this dreamlike, oniric significance with the relevant elements of the space, meaning the motorcyclists.
Yeah, so the first part is that the space itself was interesting to me because it's a place that I know quite well, and it's in the center of Mexico, and it's also the kind of place where there is a lot of violence of the kind that the film speaks about. So it's not like making a film in a set or in a different place. This space is not representing any other place. It's representing itself, in that. It is the hotel we were in, for example, where we shot that, was full of stories that are, that the people working at the hotel would tell us all these things that were totally crazy in relation to the drug violence. And so it's not that spaces are not there pretending to be other places. And in fact, the place has a big mine, and all the people on motorcycles are miners, and like they work in the mine, and at some point I thought we would photograph the mine inside, and it would be more present in the film, and that's why I wanted to film there as well. But at the end of the day, it didn't quite work out shooting the mine, because also these are mines that are not open pit mines, so basically from the outside you just see a big mountain, so it's difficult to recognize. So we would have to go inside and change a lot of things. So I thought it was unnecessary. But I like the fact that the whole thing happens in the space where it could happen, let's say. And then the second part of what you were talking about is actually quite interesting, and it's a lot more related to, I think, genre filmmaking, which I'm less knowledgeable about and less connected with, but that this film had this immediate connection because of the acting and because of the connection with Paco and Narcos and all that. And I like when these genre films manage to do this, that the bar becomes the place of evil, the road becomes a place of wonder, let's say. And this happens in very sort of simple films, but I like also how David Lynch does this a lot, I think. And while my films, I think, are very different in that, I think there's a connection to some of the things. I never thought about David Lynch as a direct influence, but I think there are some things that are clearly, maybe I just took them unconsciously. That are
I think clearly the whole bar scene could very easily kind of bring up to mind Blue Velvet to anybody, or even
and the singing and the framing as well, perhaps afterwards, and the way I give the singer some space, and then the space of that bar in Blue Velvet is obviously super important.
Like I said, a very, very rich film. And please spread the good word about the movie. Tell all of your friends, and rewatch it as soon as you can. For me, at least it was. I've seen the film now 3 times, and every time I see something else, like, really kind of grabs me. Nicolas, thank you so much for taking the time.
No, thank you. It was a nice conversation.
So thank you very much. And hope we get to see each other soon in better circumstances.
Yeah, it would be wonderful to be able to show these movies in theaters, and to be able to see audiences in person. And it'll come soon.
Until then, I'm sure our audiences will take the film and keep it with them.
Okay. Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye.